Hey everyone, before we dive into today's stories, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It'll really help you get more thrilling and spine-chilling stories like this. I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and let's see how far our story listeners reach. I always liked working at Grey Ridge Cemetery. Quiet nights, open space, the smell of damp earth. It paid poorly, but the solitude suited me. After my last job, I needed something easy, something that wouldn't chew me up, and the cemetery offered that. I didn't expect to find murder. It started with small things. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The names on some of the older headstones seemed off. A family stone that had always read Evelyn Harper suddenly had scratches through the letters. Not weathering, not moss, actual gouges. And worse, someone had carved a new name beneath it. Lisa Trent. I froze. Lisa Trent was alive. I knew her name because she'd come to visit her father's grave several times that summer. I checked the cemetery logs. No one authorized any changes. No one had permission. I chalked it up to vandals. Kids, bored, maybe drunk. But the next night, I saw more. By then, it wasn't just one or two graves. It was a pattern. The older graves had names scratched away. Some had the names of local residents, all still alive. I started documenting everything. I took photos, notes, and I began to hear them. Whispers, low, faint, almost drowned out by the wind. I told myself it was just nerves. A cemetery at night plays tricks on you. But sometimes when I walked past the graves that had been altered, the whispers seemed to carry real words. She's next. He'll come. The first body I found changed everything. It was on a Wednesday night. I'd finished my rounds, the fog heavy on the ground, and I noticed the grave of Michael Carter had been tampered with. His name was crossed out and replaced with David Ellis. I didn't know David Ellis, but something about the way the fresh dirt had been shifted made my stomach turn. I crouched to inspect it, shining my flashlight on the disturbed soil. There was a shallow depression nearby, like someone had tried to dig out the coffin. And then I saw the boot, a man's leg sticking out from the earth. I ran. I ran so fast I didn't notice the gravestones I crashed into. Didn't see the roots catching my boots. I stumbled into the caretaker's shed, slammed the door, and dialed 911. By the time the police arrived, the body was gone. They questioned me, took statements, but I knew what I'd seen. Someone had been burying or unburying the dead and replacing names with the living. The next few nights were hell. I patrolled the cemetery like a soldier, flashlight sweeping every shadow. Every grave seemed suspect. I started marking the ones that had been altered, trying to keep track, but by the fourth night I realized it was happening faster than I could document. And then came the letters. They were small, white envelopes, slipped under the shed door when I wasn't looking. No stamps, no names. Inside, a single sheet of paper. You're too late. She's ours now. I didn't know who she was. I didn't want to know. I stuffed the letters into my coat and called the police. They said it was probably a prank, but I could feel the menace in my gut. Someone was hunting, and now they knew I was watching. One night, I decided to follow the pattern. I stayed after my rounds, hidden behind a row of new gravestones. Around 2 a.m., I saw a figure moving among the older plots. He was wearing dark clothes, gloves, hood up. He carried a small toolbox and crouched beside one of the graves, chiseling at the name. I held my breath, watching. He worked carefully, deliberately, replacing the old name with a new one. When he finished, he paused, looking around. His eyes met mine, or so I thought, and I swear I saw a smirk. Then he vanished into the fog. I ran to the grave, my flashlight trembling. Sure enough, the name had been changed. The following days were a blur of fear and planning. I went to the police with the evidence showing photos, letters, and the grave alterations. They agreed to place surveillance cameras, but the cameras didn't catch him, not clearly. Always shadows, fleeting glimpses. I started my own investigation. I checked the names that had been replaced, looking for a connection. All the new names belonged to local residents who had recently made the news. Divorces, accidents, arguments in public. All seemingly random until I realized something. The old headstones he targeted were family graves. He was sending a message, and then I understood. He wasn't just vandalizing, he was marking victims. That night, I stayed late again, hiding near the oldest section. I carried a crowbar and my phone, recording everything. Around 1:30 a.m., I saw him. A man, thin, pale, wearing gloves and a hood. He moved quickly, efficiently, digging into a grave that had been freshly marked. I waited, silent. Suddenly, he paused and turned. My flashlight caught his eyes, cold, calculating. He smiled. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. I froze. He raised a knife. Instinct took over. I swung the crowbar with every ounce of strength I had. It connected with his shoulder. He yelped and fell back, but he wasn't down for long. We fought. Gravel and dirt flew. I could feel the knife graze my arm. Pain, fear, adrenaline, they all collided. Somehow, I managed to shove him backward, and he fell into the open grave. I froze for a moment, heart pounding. Then he tried to climb out. I grabbed a shovel and hit him again. This time, he screamed, a high, unnatural sound that echoed across the cemetery. And then, finally, silence. The police arrived minutes later. I called them as soon as I could move. They found him in the grave, badly injured but alive. He had a notebook with all the names, plans, dates, evidence of multiple murders he had covered up over the years. He'd been using the cemetery as his private ledger, and the missing names were part of a twisted ritual to mark his next victims. The newspaper called it the Grey Ridge Graveyard Case. I quit the job immediately after. I can't go near cemeteries anymore without thinking of him. The calculated way he worked, the empty look in his eyes, the whisper of names carried on the wind. I still hear the faint scratching sometimes when I'm alone, and I always check the locks triple times before leaving anywhere, because I know someone like him exists, and they don't stop. I never used to be afraid of graveyards. Even as a kid, when my friends dared each other to run through them on Halloween, I thought they were just quiet places full of stone and stories. But after what happened at Rosewood Cemetery, I can't step within 50 feet of a grave without my skin crawling. It started the night I first saw the shadow by the mausoleum. When I took the job as the night caretaker, I figured it was going to be boring. Lock the gates, walk the grounds, chase off any teenagers who thought it was funny to drink beer among the dead. Same deal as Hollow Pines, where I'd worked before, except Rosewood was bigger. Way bigger. Acres of graves, winding paths, family mausoleums like little stone houses. The council had warned me about vandalism. They said kids sometimes broke in to spray paint or knock over stones. My job was to keep the place safe. The first week was nothing. Cold nights, coffee in my thermos, the glow of my flashlight sweeping across endless rows of stones. I thought it would stay that way. But then, on a Thursday night around 1 a.m., I saw it. I was cutting across the west section, near the Whitmore Mausoleum. The Whitmores had been a rich family back in the 1800s. Their mausoleum looked like a church in miniature. Stone angels carved into the corners, ivy creeping up the walls. That's when my beam caught movement. At first, I thought it was just my shadow stretching weird across the stone. But no, the figure was too tall, too sharp, standing stock still by the mausoleum door. I froze, my breath fogging the air. "Hey," I called, trying to sound tough. The figure didn't move. I raised my light, sweeping it directly over the spot. Nothing there. Just the stone doorway, the iron gate hanging slightly ajar. I laughed it off, nerves jangling, and kept walking. But when I glanced back a minute later, my stomach knotted. The shadow was there again, same place, same stance. The next night it happened again, always by the Whitmore Mausoleum. Always silent, unmoving. Whenever my light hit it directly, it vanished. By the third night, I started dreading my rounds. My brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe someone was messing with me. Maybe shadows just played tricks in the moonlight. But deep down, I felt watched. Then things escalated. I just finished checking the east gate when I heard it. A clang. Metal on stone. It came from the direction of the mausoleum. I gripped my flashlight tighter and walked toward it, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the Whitmore plot, my heart nearly stopped. The mausoleum gate was wide open. I shone the light inside. Empty stone floor, empty walls, except for the far end where a slab had been shifted. Someone had moved one of the coffins. The clang came again, echoing deep inside. And then I realized this mausoleum had a staircase, leading down. I should have turned and called the cops, but something pulled me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or stubbornness. I stepped inside. The air was colder, damp, smelling of earth and rot. My boots scraped stone as I descended. At the bottom, the beam of my flashlight caught a figure. Not a ghost, a man. He was kneeling beside an open coffin, his back to me, his hands working quickly. I froze, bile rising in my throat. The coffin wasn't empty. A fresh corpse lay inside, face waxy, eyes half shut. The man was cutting into its chest with a knife. I gagged. The sound gave me away. The man spun around, his face pale, wild eyes gleaming in the light. He hissed like an animal, clutching the knife. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he lunged. I scrambled back up the stairs, boots slipping on stone. His footsteps pounded behind me. I barely shoved the iron gate shut in time, slamming it into his arm. He howled, the knife clattering outside. I kicked it away and bolted. I didn't stop until I was back in the shack, chest heaving, sweat dripping down my neck. I called the cops with shaking hands, but by the time they arrived, the mausoleum was empty. No man, no corpse, just stone slabs, sealed neat and tight. The officers looked at me like I was crazy, but I wasn't crazy, because the next night, the shadow was back, standing by the mausoleum door waiting, and I realized something chilling. He wasn't a ghost, he lived there. From then on, it was war. Every night I'd see signs, locks missing, soil disturbed, cigarette butts still warm. Whoever he wasn't alone. There were more of them, working in the dark. I started sleeping in the shack with the crowbar by my side, jumping at every sound. The whispers began soon after. Sometimes, while walking past the Whitmore crypt, I'd hear them. Low, urgent voices drifting up from below carried on the cold air. I never caught the words, just the cadence, businesslike, deliberate. I knew what they were doing. Organ trafficking, grave robbing, who knows what else. And every time I shone my light on that doorway, the shadow stood there, waiting. The final night came like a storm breaking. It was Thursday again. 1 a.m. I heard the clangs before I even reached the west side. My stomach twisted. I knew I couldn't keep playing cat and mouse. Either I exposed them, or I'd end up in one of those coffins. So I pulled out my phone and started recording. I crept to the mausoleum, light off, breath held. Voices echoed from below, louder this time. Laughter, clinking bottles. I edged closer, phone raised, and leaned just far enough to capture it. Figures moving in the basement, dragging something heavy across stone. That's when my boot slipped, a pebble skittered across the floor. Silence fell below. Then, footsteps rushing up the stairs. I ran. Shouts rang behind me, furious, closing fast. My lungs screamed as I bolted through the rows of graves, flashlight beam jerking wildly. "Get him!" someone roared. I dove behind a tall monument, crouching low, heart slamming. Figures with flashlights swept the paths, searching. One beam passed inches from me. I gripped my phone like a lifeline. I had proof. Finally, proof. But I knew they wouldn't let me leave alive. So I made a choice. I darted toward the chapel, flung the door open, and scrambled inside. The place reeked of mold, pews rotting, stained glass cracked. I ducked behind the altar, panting. Footsteps followed. Voices whispered, "He's in here." The door slammed shut. My hand shook on the crowbar. I knew it was me against them. And then, something strange happened. The candles, old, half-melted, lit themselves, one by one, soft flames flickering in the dark. The men froze. One hissed. Another snarled, "It's just a draft." But their voices wavered. The flames grew brighter, crackling. The air thickened, charged, and for a moment, even I believed the dead were watching. That hesitation was my chance. I swung the crowbar hard, catching the closest man across the temple. He dropped. The others lunged, chaos exploding in the chapel. My crowbar smashed bones. Their fists slammed into my ribs. I screamed, fought, clawed. Somehow I made it to the door, stumbling into the night, blood slick on my face. I didn't stop running until I burst out the main gate, straight into the flashing lights of a patrol car. The police raided the mausoleum. They found everything. Fresh corpses, organs packed in coolers, tools, records. The men were arrested. Not all of them, but enough. And the Whitmore Mausoleum was sealed forever. But still, sometimes when I close my eyes, I see it. The shadow, standing silent by the door, waiting for me to come back. I used to think the worst thing about working in a cemetery at night would be the silence. That crushing kind of quiet where your own footsteps sound like gunshots and every breath feels like an intrusion. I was wrong. The worst thing isn't the silence. It's when you realize you're not alone. When I first took the job at Hollow Pine Cemetery, I thought I'd lucked out. Easy paycheck, no boss breathing down my neck, no customers to deal with. Just me, a thermos of coffee, a flashlight, and the dead. It was supposed to be temporary. I'd lost my warehouse job after some layoffs, bills were piling up, and this was the only night shift I could land. The pay wasn't good, but it was steady. Lock the gates, patrol a few times, keep an eye out for vandals or drunks who thought it was funny to sneak in among the graves. That first week, nothing happened. I'd do a couple laps, make notes in the logbook, then hunker down in the caretaker's shack with whatever paperback I'd brought. Sometimes I walked between the rows of graves to keep awake, reading the old names carved in stone. There was something weirdly peaceful about it, like the world's noise had finally been shut off. But then came that night, the night I found the fresh dirt. It was late, maybe 2:30 in the morning, when I saw it. I'd been walking the southern path near the old section, where the stones leaned like broken teeth and the trees loomed low. My flashlight beam caught on something strange, soil piled unevenly on the grass. I stopped. It wasn't near any marked grave, just a patch of ground 6 feet long, recently dug. My stomach dropped when I saw fabric sticking out. A torn scrap, dirty, wet, clinging to something underneath. I nudged it with my boot. That's when I saw it. Skin, waxy skin. I staggered back so fast I nearly tripped over a headstone. Someone had buried a body. I pulled my phone out with shaking hands and was about to dial the cops when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a shovel cutting into dirt. Not far away. I turned, flashlight sweeping across the mist, and froze. There was a man, thin, gaunt, filthy. He was digging into another patch of earth, shovel rising and falling with mechanical rhythm. His head jerked up at the beam of my light. Our eyes locked. For a second, neither of us moved. His lips moved, whispering something I couldn't catch. Then he dropped the shovel and bolted into the trees. I chased him like an idiot. My flashlight swung wildly, boots pounding gravel, but the fog was too thick and the paths twisted too much. Within minutes, he was gone. When I came back to the site, the shovel was gone too, and the mound of dirt, when the cops finally dug it up, was empty. No fabric, no body, just plain earth. They gave me looks I hated, half skeptical, half mocking. One officer even said, "Maybe lay off the coffee, night shifts can play tricks." But I knew what I'd seen, and that was just the beginning. Over the next week, little things started happening. I'd hear footsteps that didn't match mine, gravel crunching a few rows away, then silence when I turned my light. I'd find cigarette butts still smoldering, but no one around. Once, I found a pair of muddy gloves lying across a gravestone, still damp, as though just taken off. Then came the locks. One night as I did my rounds, I noticed the padlock on the south gate was gone, not broken, gone as if it had been removed with a key. I reported it to the council the next morning. They replaced it. 2 nights later, the east gate lock was missing. Someone was getting in, not kids, not vandals, someone with purpose. The breaking point came 3 weeks in. I was walking near the north crypts when I heard muffled voices. Low, tense, hurried. I crept closer, careful not to crunch the gravel. My light was off, only the pale glow of the moon guiding me. There were 3 men, crouched by a fresh grave, their hands moving fast as they lifted something heavy from the earth. It took a moment to realize what I was seeing. They weren't burying, they were digging up, and they weren't stealing jewelry or headstones. They were pulling out a coffin. My heart thundered. The sound of wood splintering carried in the air as they pried it open. One of them muttered, "Hurry the fuck up," and another hissed back, "Keep your voice down." Then I saw what was inside. The corpse wasn't whole. Its chest cavity had been cut open. Something glistened in the moonlight, half missing, half mangled. One of the men reached in with gloved hands and lifted something wet, wrapping it quickly in plastic. I gagged, covering my mouth, bile rising in my throat. They were harvesting organs. One of them snapped his head up suddenly, and I realized too late the wind had shifted. Their cigarette smoke had carried my way. "Someone's here," he growled. I bolted. Branches whipped my face as I tore down the path, lungs burning, heart pounding. I didn't look back, but I could hear them chasing, heavy boots slamming behind me. The caretaker's shack was too far. I veered toward the chapel instead, shoving the rotted door shut behind me and pressing my back against it, chest heaving. Footsteps crunched outside. Voices whispered, "He saw. Get him. Shut the fuck up. Just find him." I crouched low, heart slamming so hard I thought it would echo. My flashlight was still in my hand, trembling. I killed it, drowning the room in black. For minutes, maybe hours, they circled, opening doors, calling out softly. Once, a hand rattled the chapel handle. I bit down on my sleeve to keep from screaming. Then silence. I don't know how long I stayed there before I dared move. When I finally stepped outside, the cemetery was empty. But on the chapel door, scratched into the wood with something sharp, were 3 words, "We see you." The police didn't believe me. Not really. They came, they checked, but by then there was no dug-up grave, no broken coffin, just neat rows of stones. I begged them to check for tampered graves, missing bodies, anything, but the officer just sighed and told me stress can cause vivid imagination. I didn't imagine the words carved into that door. I didn't imagine the sound of organs being lifted from the dead. So I kept working. I needed the money. But I started carrying a crowbar, and I started keeping notes, times, dates, every little thing I saw or heard. That's when I realized the pattern. Every Thursday night, like clockwork, something happened. A missing lock, a fresh mound of soil, cigarette butts near new graves. Whoever they were, they worked on a schedule, and I was the only one who knew. The night it all came to a head was bitter cold, frost crunching under my boots. I told myself I'd catch them, maybe even photograph them. I had my phone ready, battery charged, crowbar tucked in my belt. Around 1 a.m., I heard the shovels. South side, near the old oaks. I crept closer, every nerve screaming. There were 4 of them this time. Headlamps strapped on, faces shadowed. They dug fast, efficient, like they'd done it 100 times. When they hit the coffin lid, I raised my phone and snapped a photo. The click was soft, but not soft enough. One headlamp swung my way. There! I bolted before the others even turned. My lungs burned as I sprinted through the fog, crashing over graves, stumbling on roots. Shouts echoed behind me. I reached the caretaker's shack, slammed the door, shoved the desk in front of it. My hands fumbled with the phone, dialing 911, but the call never went through. No signal. The pounding started almost immediately. Fists, boots, shoulders slamming into the wood. The desk jumped with each hit. "Open the door, you little shit," one of them roared. "He's got photos," another barked. My hands shook so badly I dropped the phone. The wood began to splinter. I grabbed the crowbar. When the door finally gave, I swung. The metal connected with a sickening crack. A scream tore through the night. I didn't stop. I swung again and again until the figure crumpled. The others hesitated in the doorway, then rushed me at once. I don't remember all of it, just flashes. A boot in my ribs, my crowbar smashing into someone's knee, blood spraying my face. At some point I was outside, crawling through frost, lungs searing. Headlamps bobbed behind me like hunting dogs. I stumbled into the chapel, slamming the door, dragging a pew in front of it. My chest heaved, blood dripping from my nose. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. There was someone in the shadows. Not one of them. Older, frailer. It was the groundskeeper before me, or what was left of him. His throat was slit ear to ear, dried black, his body propped in the corner like a discarded doll. His uniform was still on. His eyes, wide and glassy, stared through me. The truth hit me like a hammer. They hadn't just killed strangers, they killed him too. And now they wanted me next. The pew shuddered as the door slammed. Wood began to splinter. I looked down at the crowbar, at my shaking hands. I knew I wouldn't last. So I lit the place on fire. I don't even remember striking the match. Just the whoosh of dry wood catching, the smoke pouring, the heat searing my face. The men outside screamed as the flames spread. Some tried to break in. Others cursed and ran. I kicked open the back door, coughing, choking, stumbling into the night as the chapel roared behind me. By the time the fire trucks came, the men were gone. But not all of them. One body was found near the door, skull caved in from a crowbar. Another was pulled, half-burned from the wreckage. The police finally believed me. Organ trafficking, grave robbing, murder. The whole operation had been running for years, right under their noses, and I just happened to be the idiot who stumbled into it. I quit the job the next day. I still see their faces when I close my eyes, the way they looked at me when they realized I'd seen too much. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I swear I hear shovels scraping dirt. But maybe that's just in my head. At least I hope it is. Because if it's not, someone else is out there, still digging. I thought I knew what fear was. I thought I understood danger. I didn't. Not until the first body appeared in Green Hollow Cemetery. I'd been working there for 6 months, just another night caretaker, patrolling the rows of stone and moss under a weak moon. The pay was small, the work solitary. Lock gates, chase off kids, keep notes on repairs. Easy, boring, perfect for someone like me. But one night, around 2 a.m., I found something that shattered that illusion. It started with the dogs. I was walking near the older section, the part they called Old Hollow, where the graves leaned like ancient teeth and the fog clung low to the earth. My flashlight beam cut through the mist, sweeping across eroded headstones and ivy-covered crypts. That's when I heard barking. Not stray dogs, domestic. Loud, urgent, frightened. Coming from somewhere deeper in the rows. I frowned. No one was supposed to be here. Curiosity outweighed caution. I moved toward the sound. Gravel crunched under my boots. The barking stopped abruptly. I froze. A low moan followed. Not human, not animal. Something in between. I followed it to a mound of freshly disturbed earth. I knelt, shining the light on the soil, and my stomach turned. A hand protruded from the dirt, pale, twisted, fingers bent unnaturally. I stumbled back, gagging. Someone had been buried alive. I stumbled to my radio, but it crackled only static. I called the police on my cell. No signal. The cemetery was a dead zone. The hand twitched. I couldn't think. Fear clawed at me. But some part of me, maybe the same part that had gotten me into trouble before, made me act. I grabbed a shovel lying nearby, jammed it into the soil, and dug like my life depended on it. It did. Minutes later, a young man, barely conscious, collapsed into my arms, coughing, eyes wide with terror. He was alive, but barely. That was the first victim I found. The police investigated. They questioned me, the rescued man, even the few families with plots nearby. No leads, no suspects, just a fresh grave in the middle of Old Hollow. I went back to work the next night, shaking, unsettled. But the graveyard had a rhythm, and I had bills. So I walked the rows, flashlight in hand, listening to the wind swirl among the stones. And that's when I realized it wasn't random. I started keeping careful logs, times, locations, patterns. Every week, a new grave was disturbed, sometimes shallow, sometimes deeper. Each time, the victim was gone or dead before being buried. And always, the graves were chosen from the oldest part of the cemetery, places where the shadows clung thickest. Then came the whispers. At first I thought it was the wind, brushing through the mausoleums over the headstones, but sometimes I swore I heard names, whispers that seemed too deliberate to be nature. He's coming, don't look, watch, bury. I told myself I was imagining it. But the unease grew. 2 months in, I noticed something chilling. The missing people had all been in the news, stories of disappearances, missing teenagers, young adults, families desperate. The killer had been working for years, long before I arrived. The cemetery wasn't just a graveyard, it was a hunting ground. I started carrying a crowbar, pepper spray, even a knife in my coat. The police installed cameras, but they mostly captured shadows, flashes of movement. Whoever he was, he knew the cemetery like the back of his hand. Then came the night of the ladder. I was making my rounds near the north crypts, the fog thick enough to choke visibility to 20 feet, when I saw it. A ladder leaning against a mausoleum. Atop it, a figure crouched, opening a sealed crypt door. His movements were precise, careful. My flashlight trembled in my hand. I watched, heart hammering, as he dragged something out. A body. I knew I had to act. I stepped forward and the floorboards cracked beneath me. The figure froze, then turned. He was tall, broad-shouldered, face hidden under a hood, but the eyes cold, calculating, lifeless. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, almost conversational. I swung the crowbar. He dodged, fast, like he'd done this before. And he had. We fought, shoving, punching, swinging. Gravel scattered, stone slabs shook. He tried to stab me, and I barely dodged, slashing at his arm. A scream echoed through the crypts. I ran. The chase went on for hours. He used the paths like a labyrinth. I knew the cemetery better than him, but the fog and shadow were his allies. He ambushed me, forcing me to jump over graves, scramble down embankments, slip through hedges. Every turn, my flashlight beam caught him just for a second, then gone. I realized something terrible. He wasn't stopping. And if I didn't act, he'd keep killing. Finally, I remembered the caretaker's shed. Inside, I found gasoline and matches. I set the shed alight, and the fire lit the night like a flare. I ran toward it, screaming, hoping to draw him out. He came, eyes wide, knife raised. And that was the moment I saw an opening. I swung the crowbar, hitting him square in the knee. He went down, knife clattering. I ran past, threw a wooden crate at him, and slammed the shed door. Flames swallowed him. I didn't stop until the fire department arrived. When the police arrived, they found evidence beyond imagination. The shed contained lists of victims, tools, clothing, records of killings. Green Hollow Cemetery had been his private domain, a place where he hid bodies and covered tracks for years. Several arrests followed. Other accomplices came to light. Families were given closure. The young man I rescued, he identified the killer. I quit the cemetery job immediately. I still dream about the shadows, the whispering graves, the fog that hides horrors. I still see him sometimes in my mind, tall, hooded, smiling like it's a game. But I know the truth. The dead don't always stay buried, and sometimes the living are the real monsters. I thought working nights in a cemetery would be boring. It was supposed to be easy money. Lock gates, patrol the rows, check the mausoleums, keep the place from being vandalized. I didn't expect to be running for my life or listening to a bell that didn't belong to anyone alive. I learned fast. Greenfield Cemetery was old, almost forgotten in parts. Families who'd moved away left graves untended, tombstones weathered, ivy curling over names that no one spoke aloud anymore. But some families had paid extra, bronze plaques, marble markers, and the old safety bells installed on coffins in the 1800s. The bell ringers, they called them. Bells attached to cords meant to alert the surface in case someone was buried alive. Quack science then, relics now, but the bells were still there, hidden beneath wooden coffins, delicate knit metal with tiny hammers. I first noticed something odd on a Thursday night, just past midnight. I was walking the western section, flashlight sweeping the ground. Fog curled along the paths. Everything smelled of damp earth and decay. Then I heard it, a faint ding. At first I ignored it, maybe a car gate malfunction or a loose weather vane somewhere. But then it came again. Ding, ding. Closer this time. The sound seemed to be coming from the old Hargrove crypt. I froze. The Hargroves were long dead, their family plot sealed tight. No one should have been there. I raised my flashlight. Shadows stretched over the gravestones, mist curling like smoke. The bell rang again. I swallowed hard. Someone was inside. I approached slowly, heart hammering, boots crunching on frost-covered gravel. The crypt door was locked, as it had been for decades. But the bell rang again, a soft ding, then silence. I pounded on the door. Hello? Anyone there? Nothing. I circled the mausoleum, looking for another entrance. That's when I saw it, a small side hatch, hidden by ivy. The lock was broken. I pushed the hatch open. Cold air blew out. Inside, the dust was thick, the smell of earth heavy. The bell, small and delicate, was swinging slightly, though no one touched it. I didn't know then that the swing of that bell would be the first clue of something much worse. The next night, I came back earlier. I wanted to check, just in case it had been a prank or wind or my imagination. It wasn't. The crypt hatch had been opened again. Fresh footprints in the dust led to the coffins. And one coffin, the one with the bell, had a scratch in the wood, like a tool had been used to pry it open. I called the police. They came, examined it, said it was old, probably weather damage. Maybe a raccoon, one officer joked. I wasn't convinced. 2 nights later, I heard the bell again. This time, I stayed hidden behind a gravestone, my flashlight off. The bell rang faintly. And then a shadow moved. Someone crouched beside the Hargrove coffin. I couldn't see their face, but I could see their hands, gloved, carefully lifting the coffin lid. A body inside. Not a Hargrove. Someone else. Someone recently dead. I bit back a scream. I didn't want to alert them. They lifted something from the coffin, wrapped it, careful, methodical. Then they paused, scanning the fog. The bell rang again accidentally, a soft ding, and I thought I'd been seen. I froze. The figure turned slowly, face obscured. Their eyes glinted in the moonlight. I couldn't move. Then they ran, disappearing into the mist. I reported it to the police again. This time they took it seriously. Cameras were installed around the crypts. But every morning the footage was corrupted, missing segments, as though someone knew how to erase it. The bells kept ringing. I started my own investigation. I spent hours reading records in the cemetery office, cross-referencing death notices, obituaries, and missing person reports. That's when the pattern emerged. The coffins with bells, always in the old section, always near graves whose families were gone or forgotten, were being used to hide bodies. The bell was a marker for someone to come back and retrieve or tamper with the coffin. The person wasn't just a vandal. They were organized, experienced, dangerous. The night I almost died was one I will never forget. I was patrolling the southern crypts, the fog thicker than usual. Bells dinged again. I followed the sound, moving quietly, crouching behind tombstones. My flashlight caught movement, a figure kneeling by a coffin. I recognized the knife glinting in their hand. I froze, heart pounding. I realized I was looking at a killer. The bell rang. My breath caught. He turned slowly, pale face, dark eyes, gloved hands. And then he lunged at me. I ran. Gravel sprayed under my boots. My flashlight flicked wildly. Branches whipped at me. The fog swallowed the figure. But I knew he was following. I barricaded myself in the caretaker's shed. I called 911, hands shaking, trying to explain, but the line kept cutting out, static, and then the bell rang, softly. Just outside the window, I froze. My blood ran cold. He had found me. I grabbed my crowbar, heart hammering. The bell rang again. Ding, ding, ding. Someone was trying to get in. I could hear the rasp of breath. I swung the door open as the figure slammed against it. Our fight was brutal. Knife slashed my arm, crowbar hit his shoulder. He stumbled. I kicked him into the mud. He scrambled, laughing, insane, and I ran. I ran until I burst into the main gates, collapsing in the parking lot, coughing, bleeding, exhausted. The police finally arrived. With my testimony and the cameras partially recovered, we traced his movements. A man in his 50s, ex-gravedigger, had been stealing bodies from coffins with bells to sell organs and cover up murders. The bells weren't ghosts, not magic, just human trickery, timing, and a grotesque understanding of the cemetery layout. He was arrested, convicted, and the bells, disconnected, sealed, history preserved. I quit the cemetery after that night. Sometimes I still hear faint ringing in my dreams. Bells swinging slowly, soft dings in the fog. I see shadows crouched beside coffins, the faint glint of a knife in the moonlight. But I know the truth. It was never supernatural. Just human evil. And the dead, well, they only seemed restless because someone was using them as cover for murder. I always liked the quiet of the graveyard at night. Most people feared it, avoided it, but I thrived there. There was something about walking among the gravestones, the fog drifting low across cold earth, that felt safe, controlled, even when the moon was hidden behind thick clouds, until the vanishing lights started. It began subtly, 2 weeks into my shift as the night caretaker at Willow Creek Cemetery. I was patrolling the western section, flashlight beams slicing through the fog, boots crunching over frost-tipped grass. Everything seemed ordinary until I noticed a faint glow ahead, a soft flickering light weaving between the gravestones. At first, I thought it was a lantern someone had left behind. I called out, "Hey, who's there?" No response. The light continued its slow, drifting movement, not constant, not predictable, almost alive. I approached cautiously. The fog thickened as I got closer. Then the light vanished, just like that. Gone. I frowned. Maybe an animal? Maybe my eyes playing tricks. But I knew what I had seen. The next night, the lights returned. This time, 2 of them, moving silently through the oldest graves, the neglected rows where the stones leaned like tired sentinels. I followed, keeping low, hiding behind a crumbling monument. They moved with purpose, not random, not playful, careful, methodical. And then I realized the horrifying possibility. Someone was in the cemetery at night, working, hiding, doing something. For the next week, I made careful observations. I saw the lights almost every night. Sometimes a single point, sometimes 3 or 4. They never made noise, never responded to my calls. They vanished when I approached, as though they knew I was there. I started taking notes, mapping the paths. Patterns emerged. The lights were always near graves of recent deaths, or plots rumored to contain valuables. Occasionally they hovered near mausoleums, especially the ones that had been neglected for decades. Then came the whispers, soft at first, rustling voices, indistinct. Sometimes I thought I heard a woman calling for help, a child laughing, but the wind carried everything. Sometimes I thought it was my imagination. But one night I saw something that confirmed my worst fears. It was nearly 2 a.m. I was walking the north section, flashlight cutting narrow arcs across the fog, when the largest of the lights appeared again. I hid behind a leaning headstone, heart hammering. It moved deliberately toward a fresh grave. The earth had been disturbed recently, not enough to notice in daylight, but obvious in the moonlight. And then I saw him. A man dressed in black, gloved, kneeling beside the grave. He had a shovel. He lifted it carefully, digging into the soil. The light, small lanterns he carried, reflected off his knife as he worked. I froze. My blood ran cold. This wasn't supernatural. This was something much worse. I watched as he worked for nearly 20 minutes, his movements precise. Then he pulled something from the grave, wrapped in black cloth. A body. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I stayed hidden, terrified, notebook ready in my pocket to document it all. The body was lifted onto a stretcher-like frame, and two more figures appeared, also carrying lanterns. They moved silently, almost ghost-like. They didn't see me, or maybe they didn't care. And then, the lights vanished. I blinked. They were gone. The fog was empty. My heart raced. I reported it to the local police, but as usual, cameras didn't capture enough evidence. Just fleeting points of light, flashes that could be anything. I realized I had to take matters into my own hands. I started watching the cemetery from concealed locations. I noticed a pattern. The lights always moved in the same areas, always toward the graves of people who had recently died, and always at the same time, between 1:45 and 2:15 a.m. I prepared. Flashlight, crowbar, gloves, camera. I stayed in position until the lights appeared. The night I caught them, the fog was thick, swirling low across the gravestones. The lights appeared, 3 lanterns this time. I followed silently, crouched, heart hammering. They moved toward a mausoleum that had been locked for decades. The lead man lifted a panel, revealing an entrance below. They carried something heavy, another body, I realized. I held my breath. Then something shifted. A loose stone, a squeak. They turned toward me. I ran. The chase was insane. Lanterns bobbed behind me, shadows merged with fog. The cemetery became a maze of graves and mausoleums. I tripped over roots, slid down embankments, fell into mud. My flashlight flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed alive. The lanterns vanished again. They were gone, swallowed by fog, just like always. But I knew where they were headed, the caretaker's shed. I ran straight there, slamming the door, barricading it with a crowbar. The lights appeared outside, lanterns swinging, shadows moving. They tried to force the door. I could hear breathing, low and furious. I grabbed my phone and started filming. They pounded on the door. One of them slashed at the wood with a knife. I swung the crowbar, hitting one of the figures squarely. He went down with a scream. The others hesitated, and then they vanished, just like the lights had. The police arrived minutes later. By then, the fog had swallowed all evidence, but my footage survived. What they found when they investigated was horrifying. The cemetery had been used as a graveyard for stolen bodies, young men and women missing for weeks, hidden in old mausoleums, buried in shallow graves. The lanterns had been used to move the bodies at night without being seen. They arrested 5 people that night. They confessed to years of murders, body thefts, and cover-ups. The lights weren't supernatural. They were criminals, organized, methodical, exploiting the cemetery's fog and darkness. I quit that night. Even now, I can't walk past a cemetery at night without feeling the flicker of lights in the fog. I see lanterns bobbing just beyond my vision, shadows moving, whispering, and I know that somewhere in some graveyard, someone is using the darkness to hide crimes. The lights vanish, but the evil doesn't. I never meant to find the journal. I had just taken the night caretaker job at Ashwood Cemetery, a sprawling, century-old graveyard on the outskirts of town. The old caretaker, Mr. Caldwell, had retired abruptly, leaving me to manage the rows of leaning tombstones, mausoleums with cracked doors, and the fog that rolled over the fields like a living thing. I thought it would be quiet work. Peaceful. Boring, even. But Ashwood had a rhythm to it, a weight that settled into your chest after dark, and I was about to learn just how heavy it could get. The journal was hidden behind a loose brick in the caretaker's shed, tucked into a narrow crevice that no one had noticed for decades. I stumbled upon it the first night I was alone, cleaning the tools. The leather was worn, cracked, stained with age, but it had an unignorable presence, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled it free and flipped it open. At first, the handwriting seemed mundane, lists of graves, repairs to headstones, notes about visitors. But as I read deeper, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The tone of the entries changed. There were names, people still alive when the journal was written, marked repeatedly. Notes about disturbances, about graves vanishing, about keeping the records quiet. At first, I assumed it was just paranoia. Caldwell had worked there for decades. Perhaps he was overprotective or imaginative. But the more I read, the more I realized he was documenting something sinister. I began noticing things that first week. Shadows seemed to stretch differently than they should. I'd hear footsteps echoing across the gravel paths when no one was there. Sometimes I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a figure slipping between the mausoleums, but when I turned, nothing was there. And then, 3 nights later, the first grave was disturbed. I was making my rounds in the older section of the cemetery, where stones leaned precariously and ivy had overtaken tombs. The fog lay thick across the ground, softening the shapes of the gravestones. My flashlight beam bounced over the moss, illuminating carved names and dates. That's when I saw it, the freshly turned soil of the Thompson plot. The grave was shallow, the edges uneven. My stomach tightened. I dropped to my knees, examining the disturbed earth. At first glance, it seemed like a simple case of vandalism, but then I saw the faint footprints, small, precise, leading into the woods behind the cemetery. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the caretaker's shed. My hands were trembling, my mouth dry. I wanted to call the police, but even as I reached for the phone, a whisper of doubt crept in. Was it just a prank, or had I stumbled onto something far worse? Over the next few weeks, the pattern became clear. Graves mentioned repeatedly in the journal were being tampered with. Names scratched, soil moved, coffins slightly shifted, and always, the same methodical care. Whoever was doing this knew the cemetery inside and out. I started to follow the patterns, tracking the graves listed in Caldwell's journal. I cross-referenced them with obituaries, missing person reports, and local news. Each entry matched a pattern. People had disappeared, families distraught, searches yielding nothing. And the graves? Some were forgotten, some neglected, and some had been deliberately manipulated. It was then I realized the unthinkable. Caldwell had been hiding murders in plain sight, and someone was continuing his work. One night, I decided to stay late. I brought my flashlight, gloves, and the journal. I hid behind a mausoleum, watching the rows, waiting. Hours passed, the fog thickened, curling around the gravestones, muffling sounds. And then I saw movement. A figure emerged, gloved hands working carefully on a grave. I couldn't see his face, but his posture, deliberate and controlled, betrayed experience. My flashlight flickered as I raised it slightly, and his head snapped toward me, his eyes, cold, calculating, locked on mine. "You shouldn't be here," he said, calm, almost casual. My heart slammed. I raised the crowbar I'd been clutching. "Get away from there," I shouted. He laughed softly, a sound without warmth. He lunged. The fight was brutal. Gravel flew. Crowbar connected with his shoulder. He slashed with a knife, grazing my arm. We stumbled over uneven ground, crashing into gravestones. I could hear bones shift under impact, tombstones hitting the ground, a warning that nothing in this cemetery was stable anymore. The fog swallowed our figures, the sounds of our struggle echoing unnaturally. Somehow, I managed to push him back against a mausoleum wall. He went down, dazed but not out. I realized he wasn't going to stop. He was organized, meticulous, a predator with decades of experience. I had no choice. I ran, heart hammering, mud and frost coating my boots. I reported it to the police, but without the journal and my notes, they didn't believe me. Graves were old, records incomplete, and the man could vanish like a ghost in the fog. That's when I decided to dig deeper, literally. I started watching the cemetery from concealed locations, taking notes on which graves were being tampered with. I mapped every name, every date, every note Caldwell had left behind. And slowly a horrifying pattern emerged. The caretaker's journal wasn't just a record, it was a guide, instructions. Whoever was continuing the crimes was using the journal to decide which graves to disturb, which bodies to replace, which families to terrorize. One night, the fog so thick it felt like swimming through clouds, I spotted him again. He crouched over a grave mentioned in the journal, digging carefully. The sound of soil scraping echoed unnaturally through the cemetery. I watched, frozen, as he lifted something wrapped in black cloth. Another body, another secret. I had no choice. I stepped forward, crowbar raised. He turned, slow and deliberate, knife glinting in the moonlight. I swung, hitting his arm, forcing him back. He lunged. We grappled, falling over gravestones, dirt flying, hands bloody and slippery. I could hear him whispering names as we struggled, the sound muffled by the fog but unmistakable. Finally, I slammed him against the mausoleum wall. He collapsed, unconscious, breathing ragged. When the police arrived, they found multiple bodies hidden beneath old graves, coffins slightly disturbed, carefully replaced soil. They identified the man I fought as a serial offender, using Caldwell's journal as a blueprint to continue decades-old crimes. I left the cemetery that morning. I never went back. But sometimes when the fog rolls over a quiet field, I dream of the pages of that journal, of the names, the graves, the careful, meticulous plotting of a life spent hiding murder in plain sight. I've never believed in ghosts, but I know some places hold evil long after the people are gone. And Ashwood Cemetery, it still whispers. I never believed in urban legends, not until the night I became part of one. I had just taken the night caretaker job at Pine Hollow Cemetery, a sprawling graveyard on the edge of town. The cemetery was a mix of old and new graves, winding paths through thick fog, mausoleums with iron gates that creaked when the wind blew. The night shift was supposed to be quiet work, patrolling the grounds, checking fences, keeping vandals at bay. But Pine Hollow had its own rhythm, and it was about to teach me a lesson I would never forget. It started a week into my shift. I was making my usual rounds in the older section, where stones leaned precariously and names were faded beyond recognition. Frost coated the grass. The fog was dense, curling between tombstones. I was halfway through the rows when something caught my eye, a coffin lid slightly ajar. I froze. I should have walked away, called someone, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached cautiously, shining my flashlight over the disturbed wood. The body inside wasn't the one it was supposed to be. The headstone read, Eleanor Whitfield, 1947 to 1998, a woman long dead. But the body inside was young, fresh, recently dead, and lifeless in a way that made my stomach twist. I stumbled back, heart hammering. My first instinct was disbelief. Mistaken identity? A prank? But the coffin had been sealed for decades. The wood was heavy, untouched. Someone had gone to great lengths to swap the body. I ran to the cemetery office and checked the records. Eleanor Whitfield had indeed been buried 20 years ago. The records matched. This was no mistake. Someone had stolen the original body, or the replacement had been planted there, and I had no idea why. I tried to rationalize it. Organ trafficking? Grave robbery? Something else? I didn't know. I only knew that whatever had happened, someone was using the cemetery at night to hide it. The following nights were worse. I patrolled the cemetery obsessively, flashlight scanning every corner, every mausoleum, every shadow. I started noticing subtle signs. Disturbed earth near old graves, footprints that didn't belong to maintenance workers, faint dragging marks in the mud. Sometimes I thought I heard whispers, low and unintelligible, carried by the wind. Other nights, lanterns appeared in the fog, small points of light that moved with purpose, vanishing when I approached. One night, I followed the lights. They led me to the northern section, the oldest part of the cemetery, where graves leaned like soldiers at attention, and the fog never lifted. I crouched behind a fallen tombstone, holding my breath as I watched three figures, gloved, hooded, open a fresh grave. They worked silently, lifting a body carefully from the earth. They swapped it with another I could barely see. My mind reeled. Why? How? Who were they doing this to? I didn't move. I couldn't. My pulse was deafening in my ears. That was when I first realized the pattern. The body swaps weren't random. The graves they targeted belonged to wealthy families, those recently deceased. Some had valuables buried with them. Others were political figures, local celebrities, prominent townsfolk. The criminal operation was clever, meticulous. The swapped bodies allowed them to remove valuables, delay investigations, and cover murders. The cemetery was their perfect cover. I started documenting everything. I made a map of the cemetery, marking which graves had been disturbed, the time of night the lights appeared, the paths the figures took. I noticed something chilling. The same graves were repeatedly used, the same patterns every week. They knew the cemetery intimately, probably had access to keys or maintenance schedules. I felt like a rat in a maze, hunted by shadows I could never fully see. One night, I decided to catch them. I hid near the Johnson Mausoleum, a massive stone structure that cast long shadows across the frost-covered grass. My hands shook as I gripped my crowbar, phone recording everything. The fog thickened. My flashlight flickered. And then I saw them. The figures, 3 of them, lanterns glowing dimly in the mist. They carried something heavy, wrapped in black cloth. A body. I followed silently, careful not to make a sound. They moved toward a freshly dug grave. I could hear the faint creak of the coffin lid as they swapped the body. One of them whispered something, a name I couldn't catch. And then, as if sensing me, they froze. Lanterns swung, shadows shifted. My pulse exploded. The chase began. I ran blindly through the fog, dodging tombstones, tripping over roots, my flashlight bobbing. The figures followed, disappearing and reappearing like ghosts. They had intimate knowledge of the cemetery, cutting me off, forcing me to run circles through narrow paths. I could hear mud squelch under their boots, hear the faint sound of metal tools clinking as they moved. At one point, I stumbled into a shallow grave. My flashlight fell, illuminating a coffin, empty. The body had already been swapped. My stomach churned. I scrambled out, cursing under my breath, and finally reached the caretaker's shed. I locked the door, panting, gripping my crowbar. The lanterns appeared outside, lanterns swinging, shadows dancing across the walls. I held my breath. The confrontation was brutal. They tried to force the door open. I swung the crowbar, hitting one of them square in the shoulder. He screamed. They retreated momentarily, regrouping in the fog. I knew I couldn't hold them forever. I had to escape, but also needed proof. I grabbed my phone and ran toward the main gate, using the shadows to my advantage. Behind me, I could hear footsteps, whispers, the dragging of something heavy. My mind raced with every possibility. Finally, I made it out. The lanterns vanished in the fog, swallowed like they were never there. I called 911, breathless, and waited. The police arrived within minutes. What they found was horrifying. Multiple graves had been disturbed, bodies swapped, valuables stolen. A criminal ring had been using Pine Hollow Cemetery for months, targeting wealthy families, manipulating graves, and hiding murders in plain sight. The urban legend of bodies vanishing and swapping wasn't supernatural. It was human evil, methodical and precise. The ring was dismantled, arrests made, but the horror of those nights stayed with me. I quit the cemetery job the next day. Even now, years later, I can't walk past a graveyard without thinking of the fog, the swinging lanterns, the way shadows seemed alive. I remember the bodies, swapped like chess pieces, the whispered names, and the chilling efficiency of the people behind it all. Urban legends are real, but not in the way you think. Sometimes, the living are far more terrifying than the dead. I always thought graveyards were boring at night. Most people imagined ghosts, spirits, or some kind of supernatural force lurking behind each headstone. I didn't. I liked the quiet, the rhythm of the wind through the trees, and the way the fog hugged the earth. I had taken the night caretaker job at Ridgewood Cemetery for the money, and because the hours suited me. Simple work, lock the gates, patrol the grounds, check for vandals. That's what I thought. I was wrong. It began the first week, a Tuesday. The cemetery had a section known as the Silent Rows, an older part where the gravestones leaned like tired soldiers, and names were faded beyond recognition. I was walking my usual route when I noticed a small glimmer of metal beneath one of the stones. I crouched and discovered a thin wire protruding from the soil. Curious, I followed it, just a few feet, and realized it led under the grave itself. I backed away, unease crawling up my spine. My first thought was grave robbers, but no one had dared enter this section at night for years. I returned the next night. That night, I stayed in the Silent Rows until nearly 2 a.m., crouched behind a leaning monument, heart hammering. Fog wrapped around the stones, thick as wool. Then I saw him, a man, mid-30s, dressed in black, gloves on, kneeling over a recently filled grave. He was tapping something against the coffin, a soft click, then disappearing beneath the mist. I strained my eyes and saw the wire I had found earlier. He was using it to trigger a small mechanism inside the coffin. Inside, I couldn't tell. My stomach knotted. He worked silently, moving with precision, checking every corner of the grave. Then he disappeared, leaving only the fog and a faint smell of fresh earth. I reported it to the police. They laughed. "Cemetery folklore," they said. "You're seeing shadows. Go home." I couldn't. Something about the wire, the mechanism, the precision, it wasn't folklore. Someone was tampering with graves, hiding something or someone, and I needed to know what. Over the next week, I became obsessed. I mapped every disturbed grave, documented the positions of the wires, and tried to predict when he would return. My notes revealed a chilling pattern. He targeted graves of people with wealth, influence, or connections. Occasionally, he opened older graves whose occupants had been long dead, perhaps searching for something hidden or stolen long ago. The thought made my skin crawl. One night, I decided to follow him. The fog lay thick, damp, and suffocating. I hid behind a mausoleum, watching a freshly disturbed grave. Suddenly, a light appeared, a small lantern bobbing through the mist. He emerged, carrying a large bag. He didn't see me. He pried open the coffin using a lever hidden in the wire mechanism. Then he reached inside, pulling something out carefully, wrapping it in cloth and tucking it into his bag. I almost lost my breath. I realized then that this wasn't just grave tampering. He was stealing valuables, personal items, maybe even evidence of a crime. He wasn't sloppy. He was meticulous, experienced, and dangerous. I stayed hidden until he left. Then I checked the grave. The coffin lid was slightly warped, soil freshly disturbed, the interior scratched. Whoever had done this had done it many times before. The next nights were worse. I followed him more closely. I saw him open multiple graves in one night, sometimes moving quickly, sometimes painstakingly slow. Each time he carried away something small, a trinket, a jewelry box, letters. Occasionally he retrieved something I couldn't see, something that felt personal. The man wasn't just a thief, he was using the graves as a cover for something much darker. Weeks passed. I began noticing small details that made my blood run cold. In some graves, the soil seemed rearranged in patterns, almost like messages. Some coffins had been opened multiple times, and every time I checked the surrounding graves, nothing seemed out of place, except for the small signs he left, subtle markers that only someone who watched carefully could notice. I realized then that the man had a system. He wasn't just stealing items, he was creating a trail, a map, maybe for someone else, or maybe for himself. The confrontation came unexpectedly. I had positioned myself near the oldest mausoleum, where the most valuable graves were. Fog swallowed everything, and the only sounds were my breath and the distant hoot of an owl. Then I saw him, a shadow moving near the graves, lantern swinging, hands gloved, careful. I followed silently, adrenaline pumping. He pried open a coffin I had noted weeks earlier, the wire mechanism clicking softly. He leaned over, whispering a name I couldn't make out, and I felt my stomach knot. I stepped forward. He froze. Our eyes met. What followed was a struggle I will never forget. He was stronger than he looked, faster than I imagined. Crowbar against metal, fists thrown, soil flying everywhere. He tried to pin me against a leaning stone, and I barely avoided the knife he pulled from his coat. Mud, frost, blood. It was chaos. I realized in the midst of it that the man was insane, methodical, and had been doing this for years. He had used the cemetery as his own personal vault, hiding items and perhaps bodies without anyone noticing. I fought with everything I had. Finally, I managed to push him into a deep grave. He fell, stunned, giving me a chance to call the police. When the authorities arrived, the cemetery revealed its secrets. Several graves had been disturbed, coffins tampered with. Small valuables were missing. Evidence suggested he had been using the silent rows for years, retrieving items that were stolen, hidden, or potentially incriminating. He confessed to multiple burglaries, grave tampering, and hiding evidence for accomplices. The silent rows had been his secret domain, a place where crimes could go unnoticed under the cover of fog and gravestones. I quit that night. Even now, I cannot walk past a graveyard without feeling a prickle at the back of my neck. I remember the lanterns in the fog, the wire mechanisms, the meticulous method of a criminal hiding in plain sight. Graveyards are supposed to be silent, peaceful places. But some graves witness things that never see daylight. Some graves remember.